Some places hold on to their history in ways that go beyond preservation and historical markers. Fort Mifflin, sitting on Mud Island along the Delaware River in Philadelphia, is one of those places. Built in 1771, it has witnessed more violence and death than most locations in American history. Revolutionary War bombardments, War of 1812 imprisonment, Civil War executions. The stones remember, even when people try to forget. The fort is a museum now, open to tourists who walk the same grounds where soldiers once died by the hundreds. School groups tour the casemates. Reenactors fire period-correct muskets during special events. But when the visitors leave and darkness falls over the Delaware, something else walks those grounds. Something that has been seen by security personnel, National Guard members conducting training exercises, and maintenance workers who've learned not to work alone after sunset. They call it the Faceless Man, though some who've encountered it refuse to call it anything at all. Just that thing, or what I saw. The hesitation in their voices tells you more than their words. These aren't people prone to flights of imagination or supernatural belief. They're working professionals, many with military backgrounds, people trained to observe and report accurately. When they describe what they've seen in the fort's corridors and along its ramparts, the details remain consistent across decades of encounters. The entity is believed to be William H. Howe, a Union soldier who met his end at Fort Mifflin during the Civil War. Not in battle, but by execution. Convicted of desertion and murder, Howe was shot by firing squad in 1864, his body buried somewhere on the grounds in an unmarked grave. The official records are sparse, offering little beyond the basic facts of his trial and execution. But the oral history among fort staff tells a different story, one involving questions about his guilt, irregularities in his court-martial, and a final statement claiming his innocence that went unrecorded in official documents. Whether Howe was guilty or wrongly executed, something tied to his death remains at Fort Mifflin. Not a residual haunting, not a simple replay of past events, but an active presence that interacts with the living. It appears most often near the areas where prisoners were held and where executions took place, and it doesn't have a face. This detail is what separates these encounters from typical ghost stories. Witnesses don't describe a transparent figure or a shadowy form. They describe a man in period Union Army uniform who appears solid and three-dimensional until you see where his face should be. Some say it's blank, like mannequin flesh with no features. Others describe it as a void, a darkness that seems to absorb light. A few claim they saw something worse, the suggestion of features trying to form but unable to coalesce, as if his face is trapped between existence and non-existence. The account that follows comes from multiple sources compiled over a 3-year period. National Guard specialist Michael Kowalski experienced the primary encounter in October 2018, while his unit conducted a weekend training exercise at the fort. His testimony is corroborated by 3 other Guard members and 2 civilian employees who witnessed related incidents that same weekend. Additional context comes from Fort Security Chief Raymond Birch, who has worked at the site for 15 years and maintains unofficial records of unexplained occurrences. Fort Mifflin's history is well documented. Its role in the Revolutionary War, when British bombardment killed dozens of Continental Army defenders. Its use as a military prison during the War of 1812, where conditions were brutal enough that men died from disease and exposure. Its function as a Union garrison and prison during the Civil War, where Confederate prisoners of war were held alongside Union soldiers awaiting court-martial. But some history doesn't make it into the official records. Some events are too disturbing, too irregular, too difficult to explain within the framework of military justice and wartime necessity. William H. Howe's execution might be one of those events, and if the witnesses are correct, if what walks the grounds of Fort Mifflin at night is indeed the spirit of a man wrongly executed, then the fort has a debt it can never repay. The Delaware River flows past Mud Island with the same indifference it showed in 1864. The fort's walls stand as solid as they did during the Revolution. Tourists photograph the same views that soldiers once defended with their lives. Everything appears normal, historical, safely contained within the boundaries of the past. But talk to the people who work there after dark. Ask the National Guard members who've conducted overnight training exercises. Listen to the security personnel who patrol the grounds when the gates are locked and the last visitor has left. They'll tell you something different. They'll tell you about a figure in Union blue who walks the casemates when moonlight penetrates the narrow passages, about footsteps that echo from empty rooms, about the overwhelming sense of being watched from places where no one stands. And if you're there on the right night, or the wrong night depending on your perspective, you might encounter him yourself. The soldier with no face, the man who died claiming innocence, the presence that refuses to rest until some debt is paid, some truth is acknowledged, some justice long denied is finally rendered. William H. Howe has been dead for over 150 years, but at Fort Mifflin, death doesn't always mean departure. Sometimes it just means waiting. Michael Kowalski had been in the Pennsylvania National Guard for 6 years when his unit got tasked with a Fort Mifflin training exercise. At 32, he was older than most specialists, having joined the Guard after working construction for a decade. The monthly drill pay helped with bills, and the structure appealed to him in ways civilian life didn't. His grandfather had served in Korea, his father in Vietnam. Military service was expected in the Kowalski family, even if it was just 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in summer. His unit, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 103rd Armor Regiment, primarily trained on Bradley fighting vehicles at Fort Indiantown Gap. But October 2018 brought something different. A joint exercise with Philadelphia Police Department focusing on urban security and historical site protection. Fort Mifflin, sitting on Mud Island just south of Philadelphia International Airport, provided the perfect setting. Historic fortification, limited access points, real-world relevance for both military and law enforcement. The exercise would run Friday evening through Sunday afternoon. 23 soldiers from Bravo Company, 15 officers from Philadelphia PD, and 4 civilians from the Fort Mifflin Preservation Society who'd provide historical context and site orientation. The goals were straightforward: establish security perimeters around a high-value historic site, practice coordination between military and civilian law enforcement, and conduct day and night patrols in urban terrain that wasn't their usual rural Pennsylvania training areas. Michael arrived Friday afternoon with his fire team, Specialist Danny Volpe, Private First Class Antonio Rivera, and Private Jesse Grabowski. They'd worked together for 2 years, knew each other's rhythms, trusted each other enough that communication could be minimal when needed. "This place is smaller than I expected," Danny said as they drove across the causeway onto Mud Island. The fort sat low and gray against the October sky, surrounded by water on 3 sides. Commercial ships moved up and down the Delaware, close enough that Michael could read their names. Philadelphia's skyline rose in the distance, the familiar outline of Center City visible through afternoon haze. "It's old," Antonio replied from the back seat. "Revolutionary War old. My high school came here on a field trip once. Lots of tunnels and creepy rooms." "Great," Jesse muttered. "Exactly what I wanted for my weekend. Cold stone corridors and probably no cell service." They parked in the small lot outside the fort's main entrance. The structure looked weathered but solid, pentagonal walls of dark stone and brick surrounding an interior courtyard. A moat had once encircled it, though now only portions remained. Everything about the place suggested durability and purpose, built to withstand siege and bombardment. Staff Sergeant Patrick Nowak met them at the gate, clipboard in hand. He'd been their team leader for 18 months, a prior service Marine who'd done 2 Iraq deployments before joining the Guard. Decent guy, fair but exacting about details. "Kowalski, get your team and report to the enlisted barracks. We're staging there. Command center is in the officers' quarters. Briefing at 1800 hours." The enlisted barracks turned out to be a long 2-story brick building with narrow windows and thick walls. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. Stone floors, minimal insulation, the kind of structure built for function rather than comfort. The Preservation Society had set up cots in what had once been sleeping quarters for garrison soldiers during the Civil War. "Home sweet home," Danny said, dropping his duffel on a cot that creaked under the weight. "At least it's not a tent." Michael chose a cot near the window, giving him a view of the interior courtyard. He could see other soldiers moving equipment, police officers conferring near their vehicles, civilians carrying boxes of what looked like historical documents and maps. Normal pre-exercise activity, the organized chaos that always preceded joint operations. But something about the building felt off. Not threatening exactly, just uncomfortable. The air was heavy, carrying a smell that reminded Michael of his grandmother's basement. Damp stone and old wood, and something else he couldn't identify. Decay, maybe. The particular scent of places where time accumulated in layers. "You feel that?" Antonio asked quietly. "Feel what?" "I don't know, like we're being watched or something." Michael glanced around the barracks, empty except for his team. The windows showed normal activity outside. "It's just an old building, probably rats in the walls." "Yeah, probably." The briefing took place in the fort's main casemate, a vaulted stone chamber that had once held artillery. Captain Ellen Walsh ran the exercise from the guard side. Lieutenant Frank Harrigan represented Philadelphia PD. They laid out the weekend schedule using maps projected onto a portable screen. "The fort covers approximately 6 acres, Captain Walsh explained. 5 bastions connected by curtain walls, multiple interior structures including barracks, powder magazines, and a blacksmith shop. For this exercise, we're treating it as a high-value target, requiring protection from multiple threat vectors." She detailed the rotation schedule. 4-hour shifts, mixed teams of guard and PD, covering entry points and conducting roving patrols. Day operations would focus on perimeter security and coordination. Night operations would test their ability to maintain security in low-light conditions using night vision and thermal imaging. "One note," said Raymond Birch, the fort's security chief, speaking up from the side of the room. He was maybe 60, wearing civilian clothes and a radio on his belt. "Some of the interior spaces get dark at night. I mean really dark. The ambient light from Philadelphia doesn't penetrate well once you're inside the casemates or the powder magazines. Stay in pairs minimum and keep your lights handy." "Any wildlife concerns?" Staff Sergeant Novak asked. "Raccoons, possums, anything aggressive?" "Nothing that'll bother you if you don't bother them," Birch replied. "Rats, sure. Some feral cats. But the bigger issue is the structure itself. Watch your footing. Some of the floors are uneven. There's a reason we make visitors sign waivers." The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, covering radio frequencies, emergency procedures, and coordination protocols between military and civilian personnel. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested this would be anything other than a routine training weekend. Michael's team drew first shift, 2000 to midnight, covering the South Bastion and adjacent curtain wall. They had 2 Philadelphia officers assigned with them, Sergeant Tom Brogan and Officer Lisa Chen. Both seemed competent, experienced enough that they didn't need constant explanation of how things worked. They ate dinner in the fort's small visitor center, catered sandwiches and coffee provided by the Preservation Society. The sun set early in late October, and by the time they finished eating, darkness had settled over Mud Island. The fort's exterior was minimally lit, just enough illumination to prevent accidents, but not enough to provide real visibility. "All right, comms check," Staff Sergeant Novak said as the shift teams assembled. Michael tested his radio, confirmed clear reception, and checked his equipment one more time. Rifle, ammunition, flashlight, night vision monocular, first aid kit. Everything accounted for. They moved to their assigned position, climbing stone steps to reach the top of the South Bastion. The view was impressive, looking out over the Delaware River where commercial traffic moved through the darkness, marked by running lights and navigation beacons. Behind them, Philadelphia's glow illuminated the sky. "Not a bad post," Sergeant Brogan said, leaning against the parapet. "Could be worse. Could be standing post in the rain." The first 2 hours passed without incident. They maintained watch, logged the required radio checks, stayed alert but relaxed. Michael walked the curtain wall, his boots finding sure footing on stones that had been placed there 250 years earlier. Strange to think how many soldiers had walked this same route, looking out at the same river, watching for threats that came from different directions but served the same purpose. Around 2,200 hours, Antonio called him over to the interior edge of the bastion, the side overlooking the fort's courtyard. "You see someone down there?" Michael followed his pointing finger. The courtyard was mostly dark, just one light near the command center casting weak illumination across the open ground. But near the enlisted barracks, something moved. A figure walking from the barracks toward the powder magazine, visible only as a silhouette against slightly less dark surroundings. "Probably someone from second shift getting ready," Michael said. But he pulled out his radio. "Command, this is South 1. Can you confirm personnel in the courtyard near the enlisted barracks?" Static, then Captain Walsh's voice. "Negative, South 1. All off-shift personnel are accounted for in designated rest areas. What are you seeing?" Michael looked again. The figure was still there, moving slowly but deliberately across the courtyard. It walked stiffly, like someone who was cold or injured. As he watched, it passed through a narrow shaft of light from the command center. Union Army uniform. Dark blue coat, lighter blue trousers. Michael could make out the details clearly for just a moment before the figure moved back into shadow. "Someone in period costume," he radioed back. "Civil War era, walking toward the powder magazine." Brief silence, then, "Stand by." The figure reached the powder magazine, a low stone building with a heavy wooden door. Michael expected it to stop there, maybe turn around. Instead, it kept walking, directly into the wall. Not through the door, but into the solid stone beside it. And then it was gone. Antonio grabbed his arm. "Did that guy just walk through the wall?" "I don't know what I just saw." The radio crackled. "South 1, we're sending the duty sergeant to investigate. Maintain your position and keep eyes on that location." Michael watched the powder magazine for the next 10 minutes, his pulse elevated, his mind trying to rationalize what he'd witnessed. Someone in a reenactor costume, sure. The fort held events with period-dressed interpreters, but walking into a wall? That didn't have a rational explanation. Staff Sergeant Nowak appeared in the courtyard below, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He checked the powder magazine, tried the door, examined the area where the figure had disappeared. After a few minutes, he radioed up. "There's nobody here. Door's locked. No signs of entry or disturbance." "Copy," Michael replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Sergeant Brogan had moved over to listen. "You guys saw something?" "Yeah, probably just shadows playing tricks." "This is Fort Mifflin," Brogan said quietly. "Shadows don't play tricks here. They do other things." The way he said it made Michael turn to look at him. "What do you mean?" "Ask Birch sometime. Ask him about the incidents that don't make it into the official logs. This place has a reputation, and it's not just because of the history." The rest of their shift passed without further incident, but Michael couldn't shake the image of that figure walking into solid stone. He'd seen plenty of strange things in his life, could usually explain them away or dismiss them as misperception. But this felt different, more concrete, more wrong. When they were relieved at midnight, Danny asked him about it as they walked back to the barracks. "You think we really saw someone?" "We saw something," Michael said. "Question is, what?" Inside the barracks, as he lay on his cot trying to sleep, Michael could hear the building settling around him. Normal sounds, he told himself. Old structures made noise. Wind through cracks. Thermal expansion and contraction. Nothing supernatural. But when footsteps echoed from the room above them, slow and measured, and when he remembered that the second floor was closed to personnel for structural safety reasons, he found sleep much harder to come by. Something was in this fort. Something that walked like a soldier and wore Union blue. And based on Sergeant Brogan's reaction, they weren't the first people to encounter it. Michael woke at 05:30 to the sound of reveille playing from someone's phone. The barracks was cold, his breath visible in the air. He'd slept maybe 3 hours total, kept awake by sounds he couldn't identify, and the memory of that figure walking into stone. The morning briefing was routine. Status reports, schedule adjustments, minor equipment issues. Nobody mentioned unexplained sightings. Michael wondered if he should bring it up, decided against it. You didn't make waves over things you couldn't explain, especially not in front of joint personnel from outside your unit. But Raymond Birch caught him after the briefing, pulling him aside near the fort's main gate. Novak mentioned your team saw something last night. Man in uniform near the powder magazine. Yes, sir. Yes. We saw someone. Couldn't identify them clearly. Birch studied him for a moment. The security chief had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors, lines around his eyes from squinting against sun and wind. You see where he went? Michael hesitated. He walked into the wall, or appeared to. Could have been an angle issue, shadow making it look like he went through solid stone when he actually went around. Could have been, Birch agreed, but his tone suggested he didn't believe that any more than Michael did. How long you been in the Guard? 6 years. Combat deployments? No, sir, just stateside training. Birch nodded slowly. So you've got military discipline, but you haven't seen things that make you question reality. Not yet, anyway. He glanced back at the fort, its gray walls solid in morning light. This place does that to people, makes them see things, experience things. Most of them don't talk about it because they think nobody will believe them. You're saying the fort is haunted. I'm saying something happens here that doesn't happen other places. Call it what you want. I've been working this site for 15 years. I've seen enough to know that whatever it is, it's real. Not hallucinations, not tricks of light, real. Michael waited, sensing Birch had more to say. The man you saw was probably wearing Union blue. Dark coat, light trousers, might have been walking stiff, like he was hurt or cold. That's exactly what we saw. That's because you saw him. William Howe, executed here in 1864 for desertion and murder, shot by firing squad in the courtyard. They buried him somewhere on the grounds, nobody's sure exactly where, and he's been here ever since. The name meant nothing to Michael. Why would he still be here? Because he claimed he was innocent. Right up until the moment they shot him, he said they had the wrong man. Maybe he was lying, or maybe he was telling the truth and they executed an innocent soldier. Either way, he's still here, still wearing that uniform, and if you get close enough, you'll see why they call him the Faceless Man. Birch walked away before Michael could ask more questions, leaving him standing in the morning cold with more concerns than answers. The day exercises went smoothly. Perimeter security drills, coordination between guard and police units, response scenarios. Michael's team rotated through different positions around the fort, familiarizing themselves with the layout. Everything felt normal in daylight. Just an old fort with thick walls and narrow passages, historical but not threatening. It was only when they entered the casemates during afternoon training that Michael felt the atmosphere shift. The vaulted stone chambers ran beneath the ramparts, designed to house artillery and protect gun crews from enemy fire. Now they were empty, except for a few interpretive displays. But the temperature inside was noticeably colder than outside, and sound behaved strangely, echoing in ways that made it hard to determine direction. "This place gives me the creeps," Jesse said, his voice bouncing off stone walls. They were practicing room-clearing procedures, moving through the connected chambers with simulated weapons. The exercise was straightforward, but something about the casemates made it feel wrong. Michael found himself checking corners twice, certain he'd seen movement that wasn't there. In one chamber, Danny stopped abruptly. "You smell that?" Michael did. A sharp, acrid smell that reminded him of burnt metal or electrical fires. It came and went, too brief to identify clearly, but distinct enough to register as wrong. "Probably wiring," Antonio suggested. "Old building, old electrical systems." But this section of the fort had no electricity. The Preservation Society used battery-powered lights for tours, deliberately keeping modern infrastructure minimal. There was nothing here that could produce that smell. They finished the exercise and returned to the courtyard. Michael noticed one of the Philadelphia officers, Lisa Chen, talking with Birch near the officers' quarters. Both looked serious, and when Birch saw Michael watching, he gestured him over. "Tell him what you just told me," Birch said to Chen. The officer looked uncomfortable. "My partner and I were doing a walkthrough of the enlisted barracks upper floor. I know it's supposed to be closed, but the door was open, so we checked it out. Standard clearing procedure." Michael waited. "We found footprints in the dust, fresh ones, boot prints, looked like military issue, leading from the stairwell to one of the back rooms. We followed them." She paused. "The room was empty, no other exit, but the footprints just stopped in the middle of the floor. Not like someone turned around, they just ended." "Could have been from earlier," Michael suggested. "Previous visitors." "That's what I thought, but Birch says that floor's been locked for 3 weeks. Nobody should have been up there, and the dust pattern was wrong. Prints going in but not coming out, like whoever made them just vanished." Birch handed Michael a key. "Second shift tonight. I want your team to do a thorough check of the barracks. All floors, all rooms. Document anything unusual. You've got authorization to access restricted areas." Michael took the key, feeling its weight. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Evidence, whatever form it takes. Most people see him from a distance, but some have encountered him up close, in narrow spaces where you can't avoid him. Those encounters, they're different, more intense." "Has anyone been hurt?" "Physically? No. But psychologically, some people have a hard time processing it. What they see when they look at his face, or where his face should be. The human brain doesn't handle that kind of impossibility well." The afternoon dragged. Michael couldn't focus properly on the training scenarios, his mind circling back to what Birch had said. A soldier with no face. A man executed for crimes he might not have committed. Footprints that appeared and disappeared without explanation. At 1800 hours, they gathered for evening briefing. Captain Walsh outlined the night operations. Increased patrol frequency, thermal imaging deployment, simulated intrusion response. Nothing about unexplained phenomena or paranormal activity. That wasn't part of the official exercise. But as they prepared for second shift, Staff Sergeant Nowak pulled Michael's team aside. "Birch briefed me on your secondary tasking. You're to conduct a detailed inspection of the enlisted barracks during your patrol. He mentioned you might encounter something unusual. I need you to stay professional, document everything, and report immediately if anything threatens safety." "Roger that," Michael said. "And Kowalski? I saw something here too. 5 years ago during a different exercise. So don't think you're crazy if things get weird. Just do your job and we'll sort it out afterward." Second shift started at 2000 hours. Michael's team, plus Sergeant Brogan from Philadelphia PD, assembled at the barracks with flashlights and the key Birch had provided. The building looked different at night, more imposing somehow. Windows reflected their lights back at them like dark eyes. "All right," Michael said. "We clear room by room, first floor, then second. Stay together, stay alert. This is just reconnaissance. We're not engaging anything." They entered through the main door. The first floor was as they'd left it, cots arranged in neat rows, gear stored properly. Their lights swept across empty spaces, finding nothing unusual. But the air felt heavy, charged with something Michael couldn't name. Like the moment before a thunderstorm when pressure builds and hair stands on end. The stairwell to the second floor was narrow, barely wide enough for one person. Michael went first, his light cutting upward into darkness. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, sound amplified by stone walls on either side. At the top, a hallway stretched in both directions. Doors lined it, most closed, all marked with Preservation Society signs warning visitors to stay out due to structural concerns. But the floor felt solid under Michael's boots. Whatever safety issues existed, they weren't obvious. "Check right, I'll check left," he told Danny. "Antonio and Jesse, you cover the stairs. Brogan, stay with them." Danny moved down the right corridor while Michael took the left. He tried the first door, locked. The second opened into a small room with a window overlooking the courtyard, empty except for dust and debris. The third door was locked as well, The fourth door opened before he touched it. Michael froze, his light trained on the slowly opening door. No breeze, no explanation for the movement. It swung inward on old hinges that should have protested, but made no sound. Beyond, darkness waited. He keyed his radio. "I've got an open door, left corridor, fourth room, moving to clear." "Copy," Danny replied from the other hallway. Michael stepped through the doorway, his light sweeping the interior. Standard barracks room, maybe 12 by 15 feet. One window, now boarded. Plaster walls stained with water damage. Wooden floor covered in thick dust that showed no footprints except the ones he was making. In the far corner, something stood. His light found it immediately. A figure in Union Army uniform, positioned with its back to the door, facing the corner like a child being punished. The uniform was period correct in every detail. Dark blue sack coat with brass buttons, light blue trousers, black leather shoes. The figure stood rigid, arms at its sides, completely motionless. Michael's training took over. "Identify yourself. This is a restricted area." The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. "I'm armed military police conducting security operations. Turn around slowly and identify yourself." Nothing. The figure remained frozen, facing the corner. Michael's pulse accelerated. He moved deeper into the room, maintaining distance, his free hand moving to his sidearm. The guard issued them weapons without ammunition for this exercise, but the weight was comforting anyway. "Last warning, turn around and identify yourself." The figure's head tilted. Not turning, just tilting slightly to the left. The movement was wrong somehow, like the neck bent at an angle human anatomy wouldn't allow. Then, slowly, it began to turn. Michael's light stayed centered on it as the figure rotated, shoulders turning first, then torso, then legs adjusting to face him. The movement was smooth but unnatural, lacking the small adjustments and weight shifts normal humans made. It turned like a mannequin on a rotating platform. And then, it faced him. Where the face should have been, there was nothing. Not a blank surface, not a mask, not darkness. Nothing. Michael's brain struggled to process what his eyes reported. The shape of a head was there, the suggestion of features, but no actual face. Like looking at someone through frosted glass that blurred everything into meaningless suggestions of form. His light illuminated the space where the face should be, but the illumination revealed nothing. It was as if the light entered that space and simply stopped existing, absorbed into whatever occupied the void where a man's face should have been. Michael tried to speak and couldn't. His throat had closed, his body recognizing threat on a level his mind hadn't caught up to yet. The figure took a step toward him. "Kowalski, you good?" Danny's voice crackled through his radio, breaking the spell. Michael stumbled backward, his light never leaving the figure. "Contact," he managed. "Corridor 4, unidentified person." He backed through the doorway and the figure followed. Into the hallway now, where Danny's light joined Michael's, both beams centered on the man with no face. "What the hell?" Danny breathed. The figure stopped. It stood in the hallway, arms at its sides. That void where its face should be pointed directly at them. Behind it, through its translucent form, Michael could see the doorway it had emerged from, because the figure wasn't solid anymore. It was fading, becoming transparent, revealing the wall behind it like smoke dissipating in wind. But the uniform remained clear, every detail visible even as the body wearing it became increasingly ethereal. And then it was gone. Not walking away, not disappearing in a flash, just gradually ceasing to exist until nothing remained except two soldiers standing in an empty hallway with their lights trained on bare wall. Antonio and Jesse pounded up the stairs, weapons drawn. "What's going on?" Michael lowered his light. His hands were shaking. "We saw him. The faceless man. We saw William Howe." They searched the room thoroughly, found no evidence of entry or exit. The dust on the floor showed only their footprints. The walls were solid stone and plaster with no hidden passages. Whatever they'd seen had been there and then not there, appearing and disappearing without physical explanation. In the courtyard afterward, as they reported to Staff Sergeant Novak, Michael noticed Birch watching from the command center window. The security chief nodded once, a gesture that might have meant understanding or acknowledgement, or simply, "I told you so." "Document everything in your patrol log," Novak said. "Time, location, what you observed. I'll forward it up the chain. In the meantime, we've got 6 more hours of operations. Can you continue?" Michael looked at Danny, saw his own experience reflected in his teammates' eyes. They'd seen something that shouldn't exist. Their understanding of reality had been adjusted in ways that couldn't be undone. "Yeah," Michael said, "we can continue." But they all knew something had changed. This wasn't training anymore. This was something else entirely. And whatever William Howe wanted, whatever kept him walking these halls 154 years after his execution, it wasn't finished with them yet. Michael couldn't focus on the exercise Saturday morning. His mind kept returning to that corner room, to the figure that had turned toward him with nothing where its face should be. Danny was equally distracted, both men going through the motions of training scenarios while processing what they'd witnessed. During a break around 1000 hours, Birch approached them near the visitor center. "You want answers? There's someone you should talk to. Dr. Patricia Lewandowski. She's a historian with the Preservation Society. Been researching Fort Mifflin for 20 years. Knows more about what happened here than anyone alive." He led them to a small office in the converted barracks building. Dr. Lewandowski was maybe 65, gray hair pulled back, wearing reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Her office was packed with documents, photographs, and books stacked on every available surface. "Raymond tells me you've had an encounter," she said without preamble. "With our resident soldier." "Yes, ma'am," Michael replied. "Last night, in the enlisted barracks." "Did you see his face? Or rather, what should be his face?" "We saw where it should be. There was nothing there." Dr. Lewandowski nodded as if this confirmed something she already knew. She pulled a folder from her desk, opening it to reveal photocopied documents with faded handwriting. William H. Howe, private, 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery, arrested in June 1864 on charges of desertion and murder. Court-martialed in August, executed by firing squad on September 14, 1864, right here at Fort Mifflin. She spread several documents across her desk. Michael and Danny leaned in to read them. "The official record is sparse," she continued, "but what exists raises questions. Howe was accused of deserting his unit near Petersburg, Virginia, then murdering a civilian in Philadelphia while absent without leave, a farmer named John Caldwell. The evidence against him was primarily testimony from 2 witnesses who claimed they saw Howe flee the scene." "What about physical evidence?" Michael asked. "None mentioned in the trial transcript. No weapon recovered, no forensic evidence. This was 1864, so investigative techniques were limited. But even by the standards of the time, the case seems thin." Danny studied one of the documents. "Says here he maintained his innocence throughout the trial. Claimed he was with his unit the entire time, never deserted." "Correct. His commanding officer testified that Howe had been present for duty on the dates in question, but the prosecution argued the officer was mistaken or covering for him. The trial lasted 3 days. The verdict was guilty. Sentence was death." Dr. Lewandowski pulled out another document, this one more recent, a typed transcript. "This is from Preservation Society archives. An interview conducted in 1932 with a woman named Margaret Howe Brennan, William's niece. She was 10 years old when he was executed. Listen to what she said." She read from the transcript. "Uncle William came to our house the night before he died. They let him have visitors, and he told my mother he was innocent, that someone else had killed Mr. Caldwell, but that the army needed to make an example of deserters, and he'd been convenient. He said his face would haunt Fort Mifflin until someone cleared his name. I didn't understand what he meant then. But after he died, people started seeing him, and they said he had no face." The room felt colder. Michael glanced at Danny, saw his own discomfort reflected there. "His face would haunt the fort," Michael repeated, "but he has no face." "Precisely, which is why some researchers believe the manifestation is tied to his final statement. If he was innocent, If he was wrongly executed, then his death represents a kind of erasure. His identity was stripped away, his claims dismissed, his life ended for crimes someone else committed. The faceless appearance might be a physical representation of that erasure. "You believe he was innocent?" Danny asked. "I believe there are enough irregularities in the case to warrant serious questions. But what I believe doesn't matter as much as what the evidence suggests." She pulled out more documents. "I've been researching this for 15 years, found some interesting details. The 2 witnesses who testified against Howe both received substantial payments from the Army shortly after the trial, officially labeled as informant compensation, but the amounts were unusually large." "They were paid to testify," Michael said. "That's speculation, but it's suspicious. And there's this." She showed them a newspaper clipping from 1867, 3 years after Howe's execution. John Caldwell's actual murderer was caught during a robbery in Trenton, confessed to multiple killings, including one in Philadelphia in June 1864, described details that matched Caldwell's death, but by then, William Howe had been dead for 3 years. The implications settled over them. An innocent man executed, evidence ignored or suppressed, justice perverted for political reasons or simple convenience. "Has anyone tried to clear his name?" Michael asked. "Officially, I mean." "There's no mechanism for that. The military justice system of 1864 doesn't have modern appeal processes, and even if it did, the people involved are all long dead. There's no one to hold accountable, no court that can reverse the verdict. William Howe died with a murderer's label, and that's how history remembers him. Except he's still here," Danny said quietly, "still trying to make people understand." Dr. Lewandowski removed her glasses, meeting their eyes directly. "I've worked at this fort for 2 decades. I've seen him 4 times. Each encounter was brief but unmistakable, and each time I got the strong impression he was trying to communicate something. Not to scare people, not to cause harm, just to be acknowledged, to have someone recognize what happened to him." Michael's radio crackled. Staff Sergeant Nowak requesting his team's location. He acknowledged and told Dr. Lewandowski they needed to return to training. "One more thing," she said as they reached the door. "The encounters seem to intensify when people show genuine interest in his case, when they try to understand rather than just dismiss it as ghost stories. If you continue investigating, you should expect more direct contact." Back in the courtyard, Antonio and Jesse were waiting with news of their own. They'd been conducting a patrol through the casemates when they'd experienced something unusual. "We were in the south casemate, checking the artillery positions," Antonio said. "Everything was normal until we reached the last gun port. Then we heard footsteps behind us, heavy boots on stone. But when we turned around, nobody was there." "Could have been echo," Michael suggested, though he didn't believe it. "That's what we thought. So we stayed quiet, listening, and the footsteps came again, closer this time, walking toward us from the interior of the casemate. We could hear them clearly, even feel the vibrations in the floor, but we never saw anyone." Jesse spoke up, his voice tense. "Then we smelled it, that same burnt metal smell from yesterday, strong enough that my eyes watered, and the temperature dropped. I'm talking maybe 20 degrees in a few seconds. Our breath started fogging even though it wasn't that cold outside." "How long did it last?" Danny asked. "Maybe 30 seconds. Then the smell faded, the temperature went back to normal, and the footsteps stopped. But here's the weird part." Jesse pulled out his phone, showing them a photo. "I took a picture of the floor where we heard the footsteps. Look at this." The image showed the stone floor of the casemate, and clearly visible in the dust were boot prints, old-fashioned military boots, the kind that would have been worn during the Civil War. They led from deeper in the casemate toward where Antonio and Jesse had been standing, then simply stopped. "No other prints around them," Antonio said. "Just these, appearing out of nowhere." Michael forwarded the photo to his phone, adding it to the growing collection of evidence. The figure in the barracks, the footprints on the sealed floor. Now these prints in the casemate. A pattern was emerging, one that suggested William Howe wasn't randomly haunting the fort. He was deliberately interacting with them, making his presence known, perhaps trying to draw attention to specific locations. Saturday afternoon brought another encounter, this time involving Sergeant Brogan from Philadelphia PD. He'd been checking the powder magazine, the same building where Michael had first seen the figure walking into the wall. When he emerged, he looked shaken. "I was inside, doing a walkthrough," Brogan told Captain Walsh during the afternoon briefing. "Heard someone behind me. Turned around and he was there. Guy in Union uniform, standing maybe 10 feet away. I called out to him, asked him to identify himself. He just stood there. Then I got close enough to see his face, or where his face should be, and I understood why people call him the Faceless Man." "What did you see?" Walsh asked. Brogan struggled with the words. "Nothing. That's what makes it so disturbing. Not a blank mask, not shadows, just absence. Like looking at a hole in reality. Made me feel sick to my stomach. I backed out of the building and he didn't follow, but I could feel him watching me the whole time." Walsh looked at Birch, who'd been sitting quietly during the briefing. "Is this going to be an issue for continuing operations?" "The entity has never harmed anyone," Birch replied. "Never touched anyone, never behaved aggressively. He appears, sometimes follows people, but always at a distance. If personnel can handle the psychological aspect, there's no safety concern." "That's a big if," Walsh said, but she decided to continue the exercise as planned. Michael's team drew third shift Saturday night, midnight to 0400. By this point, everyone involved in the exercise knew something unusual was happening at Fort Mifflin. The official logs maintained professional language about unidentified personnel and possible historical reenactors. But the unofficial conversations acknowledged what they all knew. The fort was haunted by a man wrongly executed, and he was making his presence impossible to ignore. They were posted on the West Bastion when Antonio noticed something in the courtyard below. Movement near the officers' quarters. Michael looked down. The figure in Union blue stood in the center of the courtyard, clearly visible in the moonlight. Not hiding, not skulking in shadows. Standing in full view, as if waiting for them to notice him. "He wants us to see him," Danny said. The figure turned, facing the powder magazine. Then he walked toward it with that same stiff gait Michael remembered from the first night. When he reached the building, he stopped at the door, stood there for a moment, then walked directly into the wall, disappearing into solid stone. "He's showing us something," Michael said, "telling us to look at that building." They radioed Staff Sergeant Novak, explained what they'd seen. 20 minutes later, a small group assembled at the powder magazine. Michael's team, Novak, Birch, and Dr. Lewandowski, who'd been working late in her office. "If he keeps leading people here, there might be something we've missed," Dr. Lewandowski said. She had a folder with her, pulling out architectural drawings. The powder magazine was built in 1776, expanded in 1813, used continuously through the Civil War. Standard construction for the period, thick stone walls, ventilation ports, single entrance. "Any hidden rooms?" Michael asked. "Secondary chambers?" "Not according to the original plans, but modifications were made during the war. Prisoner holding cells, temporary storage. Not everything was documented." Birch unlocked the building and they entered. The interior was a single large room with vaulted ceiling, stone walls, and a packed dirt floor. Empty now except for a few interpretive displays. Their flashlights swept across surfaces that had held tons of gunpowder in the fort's active years. "What are we looking for?" Novak asked. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "But Howe keeps coming here. Maybe there's evidence related to his case, something that proves his innocence." They searched methodically. The walls were solid stone with no obvious hiding places. The floor showed no signs of disturbance. After 30 minutes, they'd found nothing unusual. Then, Dr. Lewandowski noticed irregularities in the mortar along one wall, different texture, different color. This section was repointed, relatively recent work, maybe 50 years ago, but the stones beneath don't match the rest of the wall. They're smaller, different type of granite. Birch examined it closely. Could be repair work. This fort's been maintained continuously since it became a historic site. Or it could be something older, Dr. Lewandowski said. Something sealed up and forgotten. They couldn't investigate further without Preservation Society authorization and proper archaeological oversight. But Michael photographed the wall section, noted the location, added it to their growing file of evidence. As they left the powder magazine, Michael glanced back. In the doorway, barely visible, the figure stood watching them. Then it was gone, fading into darkness like smoke. "He's trying to tell us something," Michael said. "About that wall, about what happened to him. We just need to figure out what." The question was whether they'd have time to find answers before the exercise ended, and whether those answers would bring William Howe the peace he'd been seeking for 154 years. Sunday morning brought authorization that Lewandowski had been working toward for years. The Preservation Society's director approved limited exploratory work on the powder magazine wall, provided military personnel assisted, and everything was documented properly. They had until 1400 hours before the exercise concluded, and everyone needed to clear the fort. At 900, a team assembled. Michael's 4-man unit, Staff Sergeant Novak, Raymond Birch, Dr. Lewandowski, and 2 preservation specialists with ground-penetrating radar equipment. The GPR scan would show if there were voids or anomalies behind the wall without requiring destructive investigation. The powder magazine felt different in daylight, less oppressive, more like what it was, an old military building with historical significance but no immediate threat. The specialists set up their equipment, running the GPR sensor across the suspicious wall section while everyone watched the laptop display. "There's definitely something here," one specialist said. "See this shadow? That's a void space behind the stonework. Maybe 3 feet deep, 4 feet wide, 2 feet tall, like a compartment or cache." "Can we access it without damaging the wall?" Dr. Lewandowski asked. "These stones weren't original construction. Someone added them later, probably Civil War era based on the mortar composition. We can remove them carefully, document everything, replace them when we're done." Birch looked at Novak. "Your call, Sergeant. This is still technically a military operation." Novak considered. "We proceed. Carefully. If Howe keeps leading people here, maybe there's a reason." The preservation specialists worked slowly, photographing each stone before removal. The mortar was old, but not original, confirming the section had been modified sometime after the fort's initial construction. After 40 minutes, they'd created an opening large enough to see inside. Michael shined his flashlight into the cavity. A wooden box sat in the space, roughly 2 feet square, constructed from pine boards that had darkened with age. Simple rope handles on either side, no markings or labels visible. "Let me document this before we move it," Dr. Lewandowski said, taking photographs from multiple angles. "This could be significant archaeological evidence." They carefully extracted the box. It was heavier than expected, the wood solid despite its age. Someone had sealed the lid with wax that had long since hardened and cracked. When they set it on the powder magazine floor, everyone gathered around. "Should we open it here?" Michael asked. "Yes," Dr. Lewandowski said. "If there's anything inside that proves William Howe's innocence, this is where it should be revealed, where he keeps appearing." The wax seal broke easily. The lid lifted with a dry creak. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from moisture, were documents and personal effects. Dr. Lewandowski lifted out the first item carefully, a leather-bound journal, pages yellowed but intact. She opened it, reading the inscription on the first page. "William H. Howe, Private, 3rd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery. If found, please return to my family in Philadelphia." Her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages. This is his personal journal. Entries from his service, daily life in the unit, letters he planned to send home. She skimmed through, stopping at an entry dated June 15, 1864. "Listen to this. Word has reached us about the murder in Philadelphia. John Caldwell, who I knew from my father's church. I pray they find who did this terrible thing. Some of the men joke that deserters are getting bold, killing civilians now, but I cannot imagine any soldier doing such evil." She turned more pages. "Here, June 23rd. Arrested today. They say I killed John Caldwell. Say I deserted to do it. This is madness. I've not left my unit. Lieutenant Shaw will testify I was here. This is some terrible mistake." The entries continued through his trial, maintaining his innocence, expressing confusion and growing desperation. The final entry was dated September 13th, 1864, the day before his execution. "Tomorrow they will shoot me for something I did not do." Lieutenant Shaw testified truthfully, but they did not believe him. "The witnesses against me I have never seen before. They lie, and I will die for their lies. I hide this journal and my few possessions, hoping someday someone will find them and know the truth. I was not a deserter. I was not a murderer. I was a soldier who served honestly and will die dishonestly. May God have mercy on those who condemned me." The room had gone silent. Michael felt his chest tighten, reading those words. A man facing death, still proclaiming innocence, hiding evidence he hoped would someday clear his name. Dr. Lewandowski lifted out other items: letters from home, a small Bible, a photograph of a young woman identified on the back as Mary, June 1863. Personal effects that had meant something to a man who'd been erased from history. At the bottom of the box, sealed in its own oilcloth, was another document. Dr. Lewandowski unwrapped it carefully. "This is a sworn affidavit, dated October 1864, 1 month after Howe's execution." She read aloud. "I, Lieutenant Thomas Shaw, hereby swear that Private William H. Howe was present with our artillery unit on all dates he was accused of desertion. I testified truthfully at his court-martial, but my testimony was dismissed. The witnesses against Howe were not known to anyone in our unit, and their descriptions of him were inaccurate. I believe Private Howe was wrongly convicted. I believe the Army needed to make an example of deserters, and he was convenient. I cannot live with this injustice. By the time anyone reads this, I will have resigned my commission. I can no longer serve an institution that would execute an innocent man." "Shaw hid this here," Birch said quietly. "Couldn't save Howe, but wanted the truth preserved." The temperature in the powder magazine dropped, not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had opened a freezer door. Their breath became visible. Michael's flashlight flickered. "He's here," Danny said, his voice barely a whisper. The figure materialized in the doorway, not fading into view, but simply appearing, as if he'd always been there and they'd only just noticed. William Howe in Union blue, standing motionless, that void where his face should be, turned toward the box of his possessions. Everyone froze. The preservation specialists backed against the wall. Dr. Lewandowski clutched the journal to her chest, but Michael found himself taking a step forward. "William Howe," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We found your journal. We found Lieutenant Shaw's testimony. We know you were innocent." The figure didn't respond, didn't move, but the air grew colder, the pressure in the room building until Michael's ears popped. "You were wrongly executed," Michael continued. "You died for crimes you didn't commit. We understand now. We have the proof." The figure took a step into the powder magazine, then another, moving toward them with that stiff, unnatural gait. Michael held his ground, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. Behind him, he heard someone gasp, heard footsteps backing away. The faceless man stopped 5 feet from Michael. Up close, the horror of him was overwhelming. The uniform was perfect in every detail, worn and stained as it would have been after months of service. The body had substance, appeared solid, cast a shadow in their flashlight beams, but where the face should be, there was nothing. Not darkness, not a void that could be described or understood, just absence. Michael's brain tried to process what his eyes reported and failed. Looking at it created a sensation like vertigo, like falling, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of empty space below. He forced himself to look, to maintain eye contact with something that had no eyes. "You deserved better. You deserved justice. I'm sorry that you didn't receive it." The figure raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, reached toward Michael. He wanted to flinch away but held steady, letting the apparition approach. The hand came within inches of his face, close enough that he could see individual fingers, the texture of skin that somehow looked both real and not real. Then the hand moved past him, pointing at the box. At the journal Dr. Lewandowski held. "You want people to know," Michael said, understanding. "You want your story told, your name cleared." The figure lowered its hand, and for the first time, it nodded. A simple gesture of acknowledgement that somehow carried immense weight. Yes, that was what he wanted. That was why he remained. Dr. Lewandowski stepped forward, her fear visibly overcome by professional purpose. "William Howe, I will make this public. Your journal, Lieutenant Shaw's affidavit, all of it. I will write about your case, present the evidence, clear your name in the historical record. You have my word." The figure turned toward her, that terrible absence where his face should be, focused on her with intensity that made her sway on her feet. Michael moved to steady her, but she waved him off. "I promise," she said firmly. "Your innocence will be known." The pressure in the room released. The temperature began to rise. The figure of William Howe stood for a moment longer, and Michael could have sworn he saw the suggestion of features trying to form in that void. Eyes, a nose, a mouth. The face he'd lost when they'd executed him for crimes he didn't commit, trying one final time to exist. Then he was gone. Not fading, not walking away, simply ceasing to be, as if his presence had been contingent on being acknowledged, and now that acknowledgement had been given, he could rest. The powder magazine felt empty in a way it hadn't before. Not haunted, not oppressive. Just a room in an old fort, filled with people trying to understand what they'd experienced. Staff Sergeant Nowak spoke first. "Did everyone just see that?" Nods all around. All 9 people in the room had witnessed the same thing. The figure, the gesture, the promise, the disappearance. Corroborating testimony that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Michael found his legs shaking, adrenaline crash hitting him now that the immediate encounter was over. He'd stood face to face with something that shouldn't exist, looked into the void where a man's identity had been stripped away, and somehow maintained composure. But the cost showed in his trembling hands and the cold sweat running down his back. "We need to document this," Dr. Lewandowski said, her historian's instincts overriding shock. "Everything, the box, the contents, what we just witnessed. This is evidence of both historical injustice and paranormal phenomena." They spent the next 2 hours carefully cataloging everything, photographing the journal entries, Shaw's affidavit, the personal effects. Michael wrote detailed accounts of all their encounters, timestamps and locations, and witness lists. By the time they finished, they had documentation that would be impossible to dismiss as imagination or misperception. At 13:30 hours, Captain Walsh arrived to check on their progress. They briefed her on what they'd found, showing her the journal and affidavit. She read through both documents, her expression growing increasingly serious. "This is significant," she said finally. "Historical evidence of wrongful execution, potentially grounds for posthumous pardon and exoneration. I'll need to report this up the chain. The Army might want to review Howe's case officially." "What about the encounters?" Nowak asked. "The manifestation we all witnessed." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Those go in the after-action report, exactly as observed. Let command decide how to handle it." The exercise concluded at 1400 hours. As units packed equipment and prepared to depart, Michael returned to the powder magazine one final time. The wall had been carefully restored, stones replaced, everything documented. The box and its contents were secured in Dr. Lewandowski's office, awaiting transfer to proper archival facilities. He stood in the empty room, remembering the figure that had appeared there, the faceless man, William Howe, a soldier who died proclaiming innocence and spent 154 years trying to make someone listen. "We listened," Michael said to the empty air. "We heard you. Rest now." The powder magazine offered no response, but for the first time since Friday evening, the building felt at peace, as if something that had been holding it in tension had finally let go, allowing it to be just an old military structure rather than a prison for injustice. Michael walked out into afternoon sunlight, blinking against the brightness after so much time in stone corridors. His team waited by the truck, gear loaded, ready to return to their normal lives. But none of them would ever be quite normal again. They'd witnessed something that challenged every assumption about reality and existence. They'd stood in the presence of a man who'd been dead for over a century, but refused to stop existing until someone acknowledged what had been done to him. And they'd given him that acknowledgement. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. The story should have ended there. Box discovered, truth revealed, promise made. Clean narrative conclusion. But reality doesn't work that way, and neither does bureaucracy. The National Guard's after-action report landed on multiple desks at Pennsylvania Military Department headquarters. 9 witnesses, including 2 from Philadelphia PD, all describing the same encounters with what they carefully termed unexplained phenomena. The historical evidence was undeniable. The paranormal testimony was consistent. Nobody quite knew what to do with it. Captain Walsh recommended forwarding the case to Army Historical Division for review of William Howe's court-martial. That process took 3 months just to initiate. Military justice review, even posthumously, required paperwork and approvals that moved at glacial pace. Meanwhile, Dr. Lewandowski worked faster. By December 2018, she compiled a comprehensive report on the Howe case. The journal, Lieutenant Shaw's affidavit, trial transcripts, the 1867 confession by the actual murderer, and witness statements from everyone who'd encountered the manifestation. She submitted it to the Journal of Military History and Pennsylvania Historical Society simultaneously. Michael returned to his normal guard duties, monthly drills at Fort Indiantown Gap, annual training that summer at Fort Drum. Nobody in his unit who hadn't been at Fort Mifflin understood what they'd experienced. How could they? It sounded like fiction when described in words, but Danny, Antonio, and Jesse understood. They'd been there. They'd seen him. The 4 of them stayed close, meeting regularly outside of drill weekends, maintaining a bond forged by shared, impossible experience. "You think about it much?" Danny asked one evening over beers at a bar in Reading. This was March 2019, 5 months after the Fort Mifflin exercise. "Every day," Michael admitted. "Not obsessively, just, it's always there. Background awareness that everything I thought I knew about reality was incomplete." "You think he's gone? Actually gone?" Michael considered. "I think he got what he needed. Acknowledgement. Someone caring enough to find the truth. Maybe that was sufficient." Dr. Lewandowski's article comes out next month, Antonio said, checking his phone. Pennsylvania Historical Society accepted it. They're making it a feature piece. The article, when published, created significant interest in academic circles. The wrongful execution of Private William H. Howe, new evidence from Fort Mifflin, laid out the case methodically. Journal entries, Lieutenant Shaw's testimony, the confession by the actual killer. It stopped short of detailed paranormal claims, mentioning only that multiple credible witnesses have reported encounters with phenomena associated with Private Howe's unresolved case. Local news picked it up. Philadelphia Inquirer ran a feature, then national military publications. The story had everything: historical injustice, hidden evidence, wrongful execution. The paranormal elements were mentioned but not emphasized, allowing readers to focus on the human tragedy at the core. By summer 2019, the Army completed its review. In a quiet ceremony at Fort Mifflin, attended by Preservation Society members and a handful of military personnel, Private William H. Howe was officially exonerated. The desertion and murder convictions were vacated. His service record was corrected to show honorable completion of duty until his death, now classified as execution under false conviction rather than lawful military punishment. It wasn't a pardon, exactly. Those require someone still alive to receive them. But it was official acknowledgement that he'd been innocent, that justice had failed him, that history had been corrected. Michael attended the ceremony with his team. Raymond Birch was there, as was Dr. Lewandowski, who'd fought for 15 years to reach this moment. A small headstone was placed in the Fort Cemetery, finally giving Howe a marked grave, even though his actual burial location remained unknown. "I wonder if he knows," Danny said quietly as they stood before the new marker. "He knows," Birch replied. He'd been standing nearby, close enough to overhear. Haven't had a single reported encounter since October 2018. Nothing. Not from security, not from visitors, not from the staff who work here every day. First time in my 15 years that the fort has been completely quiet. Michael felt something settle in his chest. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction. They'd done what William Howe needed them to do, given him justice, cleared his name, acknowledged the wrong done to him, and in return, he'd been able to rest. "You think it's really over?" Antonio asked Birch. "I think he got what he wanted. Recognition, truth, someone willing to fight for him even though he died 155 years ago. That's all any of us really want, isn't it? To be remembered accurately, to have our truth matter." The ceremony concluded with a brief military honors sequence. Taps played, a folded flag presented to Dr. Lewandowski as the person who championed his case. It felt right, even though Howe had no living descendants to receive it. Life continued. Michael met someone, got engaged, married in 2020. The pandemic disrupted guard operations like everything else, but they adapted. He made sergeant in 2021, took on more responsibility, mentored younger soldiers the way Novak had mentored him. But Fort Mifflin stayed with him, not as trauma, not as fear, but as expanded understanding. He'd encountered something that shouldn't exist according to consensus reality, and it had been neither malevolent nor random. It had been purposeful, intelligent, a human consciousness refusing to dissipate until justice was served. Dr. Lewandowski published a book in 2022, Injustice at Fort Mifflin, The William Howe Case and America's Military Justice System. It used Howe's story to examine broader issues of wrongful conviction, inadequate defense, and the permanent consequences of military execution. The book sold modestly but well, finding audience among historians, military justice reformers, and people interested in the intersection of history and the paranormal. She sent Michael a signed copy. The inscription read, "To Specialist Kowalski and his team, who listened when others wouldn't. You gave a soldier his honor back. That matters more than you know." Michael kept it on his bookshelf next to his other military history texts. Sometimes visitors would notice it and ask about Fort Mifflin, and he'd tell them about the training exercise, the discovery, the exoneration. Most of the story, anyway. He usually left out the encounters themselves, unless the person asking seemed genuinely open to such things. His wife knew the full story. He'd told her on their third date, figuring if she couldn't handle it, better to know early. She'd listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, accepted his experience without demanding he rationalize or explain it away. "Do you think other places are like that?" she asked once. "Other locations where injustice happened? Where someone died wrongly and can't rest?" "Probably," Michael said. "Worlds full of injustice. If consciousness can persist after death, if it can interact with the living, then there must be others like Howe." In 2023, Michael received an invitation from the Fort Mifflin Preservation Society. They were dedicating a new permanent exhibit about William Howe, covering his service, wrongful conviction, and eventual exoneration. Would he and his team be willing to attend? They went on a Saturday in April, all four of them plus families. The fort looked the same as Michael remembered. Gray walls solid against spring sky, but something about it felt lighter, less oppressive. Just an old military installation with centuries of history, not a prison for unresolved injustice. The exhibit was well done. Professional displays featuring Howe's journal, photographs of the documents, timeline of events from arrest through exoneration. It mentioned the encounters carefully, using language like numerous credible witnesses reported phenomena and experiences that contributed to renewed investigation. What struck Michael most was a quote from Howe's journal, enlarged and displayed prominently. "I was a soldier who served honestly and will die dishonestly. May God have mercy on those who condemned me." Underneath, the exhibit noted, Private Howe's name was officially cleared in 2019, 155 years after his execution. His service record now reflects the truth he maintained until his death. "He would have appreciated this," Danny said quietly. They walked the grounds afterward, showing their families the locations where events had occurred. The enlisted barracks where Michael and Danny had first encountered Howe. The casemate where Antonio and Jesse had heard footsteps and found mysterious boot prints. The powder magazine where they discovered the hidden box and made their promise. The powder magazine door was open, visitors walking through as part of their tour. Michael stepped inside, remembering how it had felt that Sunday morning. The cold, the pressure, the overwhelming presence of something that refused to accept injustice. Now it was just a room. Historical, interesting, but not haunted. Whatever had been there was gone. "Did you feel him at all?" his wife asked. "When we were walking around?" "No, he's not here anymore. He got what he needed and moved on." "You think he's at peace?" Michael considered the question carefully. "I think he's finished. Whether that means peace or just ending, I don't know. But he's not trapped here anymore, not bound to this place by unresolved anger. That's something." They drove back to Reading that evening, Michael's team splitting off to their respective homes. Life continued with its ordinary rhythms: work, family, guard duties, everyday concerns. The Fort Mifflin exercise became a story they'd tell occasionally, increasingly in the past tense, something that happened rather than something that was happening. But Michael never forgot standing 5 feet from the faceless man, looking into the void where identity should be, understanding that consciousness and justice and truth were more complicated than he'd been taught, that some debts persisted beyond death, that sometimes the only way to lay a ghost to rest was to acknowledge what had been done to them when they were alive. He'd given William Howe that acknowledgement. They all had, and in return, they'd received something valuable: proof that truth mattered, that justice could be served even centuries late, that the universe might be stranger than consensus reality allowed, but not necessarily crueler. 5 years after the Fort Mifflin exercise, Michael took promotion to staff sergeant. More responsibility, more leadership, more soldiers depending on his judgment and experience. When younger guards asked him for advice about handling difficult situations, he often thought about that October weekend. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't obvious," he'd tell them. "Sometimes you encounter situations that don't fit your training or expectations. That's when you fall back on basic principles. Pursue truth, show respect, acknowledge when you don't understand something. Those principles work whether you're dealing with normal problems or the kind of things that shouldn't be possible." The younger soldiers never quite understood what he meant by that last part. That was okay. Most of them never would. But if they ever found themselves face to face with something that challenged their understanding of reality, maybe they'd remember his words and handle it with the same calm professionalism his team had shown. Because the world was stranger than most people knew. Fort Mifflin proved that. And knowing it was strange didn't make you crazy. It just made you more prepared for whatever else was out there, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for someone to care enough to find the truth. William H. Howe had been waiting 154 years. Michael and his team had given him 3 days of genuine effort. And somehow, impossibly, that had been enough. The case of Private William H. Howe raises uncomfortable questions about justice, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. His exoneration came 155 years after his execution, long past any practical relevance to the living. Yet, somehow, it mattered. The encounters stopped, the manifestations ceased. Something that had been bound to Fort Mifflin by unresolved injustice was finally released. Michael Kowalski and his team didn't set out to investigate paranormal phenomena. They were National Guard soldiers conducting a routine training exercise at a historic military installation. What they encountered forced them to expand their understanding of what's possible, to accept that consciousness might persist beyond death when circumstances demand it, when truth remains unacknowledged and justice unserved. Their credibility is important. These weren't civilians prone to supernatural belief or individuals predisposed to seeing ghosts. Michael had 6 years of guard experience, had trained in observational skills and threat assessment. His team members were equally qualified. The Philadelphia police officers who witnessed the phenomena had decades of law enforcement experience between them. Raymond Birch had worked at Fort Mifflin for 15 years, encountering the manifestation multiple times, but maintaining professional skepticism throughout. When 9 people independently describe the same entity in consistent detail, when they all report the same horrifying absence where a face should be, when their accounts align across multiple encounters over 3 days, dismissal becomes harder than acceptance. Something was there, something interacted with them, something that wanted justice badly enough to persist across more than a century. Dr. Patricia Lewandowski's research provides the historical foundation that makes sense of the paranormal encounters. Without context, the faceless man is just a ghost story. With context, he becomes something more profound. Evidence that grave injustice creates wounds that don't heal naturally. That sometimes truth demands acknowledgement even when everyone involved is long dead. William Howe was 23 years old when they executed him. A working-class soldier from Philadelphia who'd volunteered for service, who'd done his duty without complaint, who'd maintained his innocence until the moment bullets ended his life. The witnesses who testified against him were paid. The officer who could have saved him tried and was ignored. The real killer was caught 3 years later, and his confession changed nothing because Howe was already dead and buried in an unmarked grave. That kind of injustice doesn't just disappear. It accumulates, it concentrates. And if consciousness can survive death, if awareness can persist when circumstances are severe enough, then perhaps Howe's refusal to rest wasn't supernatural in the sense of violating natural law. Perhaps it was the most natural response possible, refusing to accept erasure, refusing to be forgotten, refusing to let lies become permanent history. The faceless appearance takes on deeper meaning when understood this way. Wrongful execution doesn't just end a life. It erases identity, strips away personhood, reduces a human being to an official narrative that might be completely false. Howe lost his face because they took his identity, replaced who he actually was with who they needed him to be for their purposes. The manifestation simply made visible what had been done to him. Fort Mifflin continues operating as a museum and historic site. The new exhibit about William Howe educates thousands of visitors annually about his case and the broader issues of military justice it represents. School groups tour the facility. Reenactors conduct demonstrations. The fort serves its purpose as a place where history is preserved and shared. And according to all reports since October 2018, it does so without paranormal activity. No more figures in Union blue walking through walls. No more footsteps from empty rooms. No more encounters with the faceless man. Whatever kept William Howe anchored to that location was resolved when truth was acknowledged and his name was cleared. This suggests something important about the nature of hauntings, if we accept they exist at all. They might not be random. They might not be meaningless spiritual static. They might be purposeful, driven by specific needs that can be addressed and resolved. Howe didn't haunt Fort Mifflin to scare people. He haunted it because he needed someone to care about what happened to him, to find the truth he'd hidden, to correct the historical record. How many other locations carry similar burdens? How many sites of historical injustice might harbor presences driven by unresolved wrongs? The United States military has conducted thousands of courts-martial over its history. How many resulted in wrongful convictions? How many innocent people died with their names dishonored, their truth suppressed, their actual stories lost to official narratives that served institutional needs rather than justice? Those questions extend beyond military contexts. Wrongful executions, false imprisonments, suppressed evidence, convenient scapegoats, people who died proclaiming innocence while their claims were dismissed or ignored. If consciousness can persist when injustice is severe enough, if the dead can make themselves known when truth demands acknowledgement, then Fort Mifflin might represent just one case among many. Michael Kowalski didn't ask for this knowledge. He would have been content believing the world worked the way he'd been taught, with clean boundaries between living and dead, natural and supernatural, possible and impossible. But reality doesn't ask permission before revealing itself. Sometimes you encounter truth, whether you're ready for it or not. What he and his team chose to do with that encounter matters. They could have dismissed it, filed reports that sanitized the experience, allowed themselves to be convinced they'd misperceived or imagined it. Instead, they documented honestly, investigated thoroughly, and helped Dr. Lewandowski build the case that led to Howe's exoneration. They gave a dead soldier something the Army had denied him in life, someone who cared enough to pursue truth regardless of how strange the path became. Private William H. Howe served the United States Army from 1862 until his execution in 1864. He died maintaining his innocence. He spent 155 years trying to make someone listen. And finally, because a group of National Guard soldiers took their duty seriously enough to pursue truth, even when it led into uncomfortable territory, he was heard. His service is now officially recognized as honorable. His grave is marked. His story is told accurately. That's not enough to erase the injustice of his execution, but it's something. It's acknowledgement. It's truth. And apparently, for William Howe, it was sufficient. The Fort Mifflin exercise ended in October 2018. The investigation it sparked continues in some sense, carried forward by researchers examining other cases of potential wrongful military execution, by historians questioning official narratives, by people willing to consider that the past isn't as settled as we assume. And somewhere, somehow, a soldier who refused to be forgotten finally rests. Not because time healed the wound, but because someone cared enough to acknowledge it. Because truth, even 155 years late, still matters. Because some debts can only be paid with honesty, and some ghosts only need to be believed.